But first, let's start tonight's show by unpacking a complicated news story in America which demonstrates how activist journalists are covering up a burgeoning humanitarian crisis on the US-Mexican border. Now, full credit to our national broadcaster's North American correspondent, Catherine Diss, reporting from Reynosa in Mexico, who described the crisis for Australian viewers with clarity and even shed light on the desperate stories of the surging number of immigrants being detained by border control. And importantly, Diss included the context that the number of immigrants attempting to cross the border had dramatically risen since Biden took office.
There has been a big influx of migrants to the border since Joe Biden assumed the presidency. The country is on track to record the highest number of border arrests and deportations in 20 years, and the situation just continues to escalate. There are also large numbers crossing at El Paso and also at Brownsville, where border agents are telling us that this is the largest number of migrants that they are seeing in a couple of decades. So this is shaping up to be one of the biggest challenges of the Biden administration in their first 100 days, ensuring that they manage the issue of immigration in a humane way without it becoming an even bigger humanitarian crisis.
Well, it is indeed a crisis, which Reuters reports involves more than 100,000 immigrants being detained each month, and an increasing number of children arriving at the border without a parent or legal guardian. The stories of human tragedy are very real, and they are pouring out of the region at a sobering rate. But if you were to read some left-wing publications such as the New York Times or The Guardian, you would be forgiven for forming the view that it is merely a political beat-up. Activist journalists at The Guardian in particular should be ashamed of themselves. This is a publication which prints a blurb at the bottom of each article begging for money in return for this promise. With your help, we will continue to provide high-impact reporting that can counter misinformation and offer an authoritative, trustworthy source of news for everyone. With no shareholders or billionaire owner, we set our own agenda and provide truth-seeking journalism that's free from commercial and political influence. When it's never mattered more, we can investigate without challenge, without fear or favour. Well, this disgraceful article by Nina Lakhani is pure misinformation being spread by The Guardian. The Guardian stated that it's all just political manipulation, and went on to say that reporting the true and indisputable fact that numbers were rising was an incendiary claim. And how did she substantiate these claims? Well, she spoke to one person who just so happened to be an immigration activist in charge of an advocacy group. Migration goes up and down. That's the reality of the border. Biden has different values and has given people hope. But there's no border crisis. To say so is political manipulation, said Ramona Casas, the director of migrant advocacy group Arise. We need to address the root causes and transform the broken immigration system, not more militarisation. Then this journalist took to Twitter to declare that there was no crisis at all. Now, this is disgusting misinformation by The Guardian, which has the potential to cause real harm and to delay help for those children languishing in detention. And while journalists at the New York Times were less brash about their bias, they still managed to seep it into their stories. In this story about the Democrats' new legislation, which would open a path to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants, the Times grumbles that the immigrants on the border have created a talking point for Republicans. Republicans have seized on the surge, labelling it the Biden-Borden crisis, in a new series of political ads splashed coverage across conservative media. Wrong. It's not just conservatives who think this is objectively a crisis. Even Joe Biden himself is telling people not to come over the border.
You have to say quite clearly, don't come.
Yes, I can say quite clearly, don't come. And what we're in the process of getting set up, don't leave your town or city or community.
But you can see why the immigrants seeking a better life are confused. As the New York Times mentioned, Biden is working on creating a pathway for citizenship. Many of these immigrants believe that Biden, despite belated pleas not to come, will be the president who swings the doors open to migrants. And can you blame them? Listen to Biden during a 2019 Democratic debate when he was pitching to become the presidential candidate.
And those who come seeking asylum, we should immediately have the capacity to absorb them, keep them safe until they can be heard.
A 15-second, if you could, if you wish to answer. Should someone who is here without documents, and that is his only offense, should that person be deported?
That person should not be the focus of deportation. We should fundamentally change the way we deal with things.
It is almost as if the Democrats say one thing before they are in office and another once in power. And with The Guardian and the New York Times acting as propaganda outlets, Biden simply gets away with it. Let's bring in our panel. Joining me tonight is broadcaster, author and journalist Kel Richards and columnist at The Spectator and The Australian, Rebecca Weiser. Rebecca, how are you?
Lovely to be here on Easter Friday.
Yeah, brilliant. And Kel?
Thank you, mate. Nice to be here.
Well, thank you both for joining me. Look, the thing that really jumps out at me is that if these publications, whose bread and butter really is to stand up for migrants, that's what they champion themselves as being, if they're not casting a light on what's happening at the border, why would Biden have to act?
Well, I think we've seen this film before, played here in Australia, and the reality, of course, is that the media can ignore the story up to a point, but ultimately the reality of children in cages, remember when it was Donald Trump and the border, then we had endless footage of children in cages. All of a sudden, we're not getting that reporting now. But sooner or later, this has all sorts of impacts for people in America. It has impacts in terms of jobs and wages. You know, as there is more and more unskilled labour available, it puts downward pressure on wages and so forth. So there is a real political imperative for the government, for the Democrats to get it right. But obviously, they're not feeling necessarily the pressure yet.
Definitely. And I mean, credit to the ABC. I mean, historically, they haven't necessarily covered some of this stuff fair, but they've got a journalist on the ground at the border, and she did a very good job of explaining it, I think, with clarity and objectivity.
In fact, what we saw from her was reporting.
Yes.
And what worries me is there are too many journalists these days who have forgotten what it means to be a reporter. Reporting means you reflect what reality is. You look at the real situation on the ground and you tell your readers, you tell your viewers, your listeners, what that reality is. Now, there are people living in the border states, Texas, New Mexico, California and so on. They know what it's like. They know the problem. They can see it. It's happening in front of them. They expect good media coverage to be reporting. And what we're getting now is we're getting something like commentary or personal opinion in the guise of reporting. That's a very, very dangerous switch. Unless I don't know. I feel like, maybe I'm being nasty, but I feel like blaming the journalism schools, because the journalism schools, often, they're in universities, so they're a bit left-wing, and they are encouraging journalists to be activists instead of reporters. Years ago, C.P. Scott, when he was running the Manchester Guardian, back in the days when it was in Manchester, before it just became the Guardian, he said, comment is free, but facts are sacred. That's the difference. Knowing what facts are, knowing how to report, getting the facts across to people, being accurate about before you start telling them what your opinion is or how you think you should weigh up the facts.
And
that's
a clear separation of what is opinion and what is a news story. That is very key. And one thing as well with The Guardian, they're begging people for money on the premise that they will fight misinformation, and they are the cause of it. And the very people that would most probably want to read The Guardian, they're hurting these people who are in detention, by saying there's no big deal.
Well, it's kind of funny. I mean, they say we're not beholden to anyone else, you know, but actually every newspaper should be beholden to its readers. In fact, they're beholden to their own bias, and so that's why we get this distortion. But it won't help them as well. You know, sooner or later people turn elsewhere to get the information.
I agree. And look, this could be part of the problem. This is probably part of the reason why journalists are maybe taking some of these Biden government talking points and running. Now, we've got a grab of Biden, who appears to be relying on what is a pre-approved list of journalists while he's bumbling at his very first ever press conference.
Okay, hang on. Sorry. Oh, Miss Kim.
Kel, what do you make of that? Now, we don't know for sure that he had the pre-approved list of journalists, but he's sorting through his paper.
It looks
then
like
he reads the name, and then he goes, you. And another point to make is that not a single Fox News reporter was asked, and presumably they're the media company of opposition, doesn't ask them a question.
There are two things here. The first is, speaking for a particular group of citizens, I want to draw a distinction between old age and dementia. The problem is not that Biden is 78. I mean, an old colleague of mine, John Laws, is on the air in his mid-80s and sounding as good as ever. He's fabulous. I worked with Bob Rogers until Bob was in his 90s. So let's not blame this on his age. This is he appears to have some kind of dementia. Now, that's a problem which has occurred for Joe Biden. That's what he seems to have. And what it's exposed in this case is the fact that, as you say, it's all set up. Why did it take so long? He's taken longer than any other president to have a press conference, a media conference. Why did it take so long? Because his handlers are terrified he'll go off script and he'll make a mess of things. So they were so worried about it. Everything was on a piece of paper. Everything was written down. This brings me back to my concern about the journalists. The journalists should not be saying, we will agree to you working from a list of people. You put us on the list, that's OK. Leave those other people off the list, that's fine. They should be... Even in the Canberra bubble, even in the Washington bubble, journalists should not agree to that kind of thing. They should say, we're all here as reporters, we're all here as journalists, let us all have a shout out.
Well said. And how do you make of how he handled his first press conference?
Oh, well, it was kind of hilarious, I guess, in a way. We got so many grabs out of it. In that particular one, I thought it was funny. There was one poor guy who had his hand up, and I thought, your name is not on the list. Forget it. You're not going to get a question.
Your question hasn't been vetted.
Exactly. Look, I find it kind of painful. I really do, because, you know, it's a real problem for people when their memory starts to go. And, you know, I don't find it funny. I find it actually sad.
I do find it quite sad as well.
Yeah.
He's kind of been put up here as his poster child, and he's clearly struggling. And to a certain point, it is actually... it's a bit worrying for the American people as well. Like, it's past that point where they're just funny gaffes and bumbling. It is actually a little bit serious. I couldn't agree with you more.
And who's running the country? You know, if you can't even find whose question, you know, whose name on the list to ask a question, gosh, you wonder what would happen, you know. It's frightening.